At first glance, the car looks like just another executive sedan. It has 4 doors, soft leather, and the kind of rounded, non-threatening shape that blends into a corporate parking lot. But this silhouette is a lie. Underneath the reserved exterior sits the exact same heart found in Japan's most famous sports car. This was a machine built for the boardroom, but powered by the street. It was a secret kept by a gentleman's agreement, a car that promised quiet luxury, while hiding enough mechanical violence to embarrass a supercar. This is the story of the Toyota Aristo. To understand why this car exists, it is necessary to look back at a very specific moment in history. The late 1980s in Japan were a time of absolute excess. The economy was booming. Cash was flowing through the streets of Tokyo like water. In this atmosphere, car manufacturers were not just building transportation, they were building monuments to wealth. It was an era where the taxi rides were paid for with 10,000 yen notes, and product planning meetings had almost no budget caps. Toyota was expanding rapidly, but they had a complicated problem with how they sold cars. In Japan, the dealership network was fragmented. A customer did not just go to a generic Toyota dealer. They went to a specific chain, like the Toyota Auto Store or the Toyota Vista Store. These were separate businesses with separate lineups. The prestigious Crown Majesta was the undisputed king of the traditional lineup, but it was exclusive. It was not available to every dealer channel. The owners of the Vista and auto stores were frustrated. They were watching high-end customers walk out the door because they did not have a true flagship to sell them. They demanded a car that could sit at the top of the showroom floor and command respect equal to the Crown. At the same time, the streets were changing. Nissan had unleashed the Cima, and it became a cultural phenomenon. The Cima was a big, pillarless hard-top sedan, but it had a turbocharger. It was fast, it squatted hard under acceleration, and it was arrogant. It proved that luxury buyers in the bubble era did not just want to be comfortable in the back seat. They wanted to drive. The traditional idea of a sedate, floating luxury barge was starting to feel dusty and old-fashioned. Toyota saw this shift in the wind. They realized they could not just release another soft, slow limousine to appease their dealers. They needed something that bridged the gap between the old world and the new. They needed a car that offered the social status of a Crown, but the aggression au fait, dedicated sports car. It had to be a performance luxury sedan. This was a significant pivot in philosophy. Until this point, Toyota largely kept their sports cars and their luxury cars in separate worlds. The Supra woes for speed, the Crown woes for comfort. The Aristo was designed to smash those walls down. It was the answer to the dealer dilemma and the Nissan threat all at once. It was born from corporate necessity, but the result was something far more interesting than a simple sales chart calculation. It was the moment Toyota decided that a 4-door sedan could have a soul made of iron and fire. The timing was absolutely critical. The bubble economy was at its absolute peak during the development phase. The engineers had budgets that would seem impossible just a few years later. They were allowed to over-engineer components because the cost was secondary to the statement. They were building a car for a future that looked infinitely bright. Of course, history shows that the bubble would eventually burst, the economy would cool down, and the yen would rise. But by then, the engineering was already done. The tooling was it. The Aristo was locked an Asia product of peak Japan, a tangible echo of an era where nothing was too good for the consumer. This unique pressure cooker, off-dealer politics, and economic excess created a platform strategy that the industry will likely never see again. It forced a conservative company to take a massive risk. They had to combine their most reliable, overbuilt structural components with their most potent powertrain. It was not about saving money or sharing parts for efficiency. It was about dominance. It was about ensuring that when a customer walked into a Vista store in 1991, they saw something that looked like the future. But what they couldn't see was that Toyota had just built a car that would quietly break every rule in the Japanese automotive handbook. To find the shape of the future, Toyota did not look to their own drawing boards in Aichi. They looked to Turin. The initial concept for the Aristo came from the studio of Giorgetto Giugiaro at Ital Design. This was a deliberate move to break away from the conservative, upright styling that defined the Japanese luxury market for decades. Toyota wanted a car that could stand next to a BMW or a Jaguar without looking out of place. The result was a silhouette that looked nothing like the boxy sedans of the previous era. It was fluid, organic, and distinctly European in its flavor. The most striking feature was the face. The Aristo introduced a bold four-headlight design that separated the high beams from the low beams in independent clusters. This was years before Mercedes-Benz popularized a similar look with their E-Class. In 1991, this four-eyed face was polarizing. It gave the car an inquisitive, almost aggressive stare that unsettled traditional buyers who were used to rectangular lamps. But it also gave the Aristo an unmistakable identity. You could spot it from a mile away on the expressway. It looked technical and precise, a visual promise that this was not just another comfortable taxi. The shape was not drawn just for beauty. It was sculpted by the wind. The engineers achieved a drag coefficient of 0.29, a number that rivaled dedicated sports cars of the time. This aerodynamic efficiency was crucial for high-speed stability and cabin quietness. It influenced the entire proportion of the car. The design followed a cab-forward philosophy. The base of the windshield was pushed forward and the rear deck was shortened. This maximized the interior space for passengers while keeping the overall footprint of the car tight and athletic. The wheels were pushed out to the corners, creating short overhangs that hinted at the car's agility. However, a beautiful design means nothing if the execution is flawed. This is where the story moves from Italian artistry to Japanese obsession. The Aristo was assigned to the Tahara plant, the same facility responsible for the Lexus LS 400. Tahara was not just a factory. It was the gold standard of global manufacturing. It was the place where Toyota proved they could build cars better than the Germans. The standards for panel gaps, paint quality, and assembly were higher here than anywhere else in the company. The physical construction of the Aristo required a level of rigidity that was unheard of for a sedan. To achieve this, the manufacturing team utilized extensive robot welding. Each body shell received approximately 4,200 spot welds. This dense network of connections turned the steel unibody into a fortress. It was stiff, heavy, and incredibly solid. This rigidity was not just for safety. It was essential for how the car drove. A stiff chassis allows the suspension to do its work without the body twisting and flexing over bumps. It provides a solid foundation for the mechanical components, and the Aristo needed the strongest foundation possible because the engine Toyota planned to drop into this chassis was not a standard luxury motor. It was a monster that would tear a lesser car apart. The steel had to be ready for the iron heart that was coming next. A decision that would turn this polite sedan into a sleeper capable of hunting supercars. The soul of the Aristo V300 is not found in the leather seats or the digital climate control. It is buried deep within the engine bay. The decision to equip a luxury sedan with the two JZS161 twin-turbo inline-six was a moment of absolute clarity for Toyota. It was not simply a matter of using an available engine from the parts bin. It was a statement that the Aristo was not just a car for transportation. It was a car for domination. This engine has become a legend in the automotive world, usually associated with the Toyota Supra. But its application here is perhaps even more impressive because of how civilized it had to behave. At the core of this machine lies a cylinder block cast from heavy, dense iron. In an era where manufacturers were already moving toward aluminum to save weight and improve fuel economy, Toyota stuck with iron for the 2JZ. This choice provided immense structural integrity. The block is a closed-deck design, meaning the cylinders are supported at the top of the bore, creating a fortress that can withstand cylinder pressures far beyond what the factory turbochargers could ever produce. It is an over-engineered monument to durability. When you look at modern engines with their open decks and spray-on cylinder liners, the 2JZ feels like it was built by a heavy industry firm rather than a consumer car company. It possesses a physical density that translates directly into smoothness. An inline-six is naturally balanced, canceling out primary and secondary vibrations, but The sheer mass of the iron block dampens any remaining harshness. The result is an engine that does not just run, it hums. However, the raw capability of this iron heart was hidden behind a fascinating cultural artifact of the 1990s known as the Gentleman's Agreement. During this period, Japanese automakers collectively agreed to limit the advertised horsepower of their domestic vehicles to 280 metric horsepower. The goal was to avoid a horsepower war that could lead to increased traffic accidents. On paper, the Aristo V300 obeyed this rule perfectly. The brochures and the specification sheets all listed the output at exactly 280. But anyone who drove the car knew this was a polite fiction. The engine was essentially the same unit found in the export market Supra, which was rated significantly higher. Toyota had tuned the Aristo to deliver its power with a focus on torque and mid-range response. But the potential for violence was always there, simmering just below the surface. This deception was managed by a sophisticated sequential turbocharging system. Unlike traditional twin-turbo setups that might slam the driver into the seat with a sudden spike of boost, the Aristo used a primary turbo for low engine speeds and a secondary turbo that joined the party at higher revolutions. This created a wave of torque that felt endless. In the updated V300 JZS161 model, Toyota added VVTi, or variable valve timing with intelligence, to the intake camshaft. This was a crucial evolution. It allowed the computer to advance or retard the cam timing on the fly, optimizing the engine for whatever the driver demanded. The effect of VVT Ion, a heavy sedan, cannot be overstated. It filled in the gaps. Before the turbos could fully spool up, the variable timing helped the engine breathe, providing a swell of low-end grunt that made the car feel lighter than it actually was. When you compared the torque curve of the twin-turbo V300 against the naturally aspirated S300, the difference was stark. The non-turbo car was adequate, linear, and polite. The V300 was a different animal entirely. It pulled with the authority of a freight train. You could be cruising at highway speeds, barely touching the throttle, and a slight flex of your right foot would summon a surge of acceleration that made passing other cars feel effortless. Reliability was the final piece of this engineering puzzle. High performance usually comes with a penalty in longevity, but the Aristo rejected this compromise. The engineers designed the oiling and cooling systems with massive margins of error. The pistons were cooled by oil squirters that sprayed the undersides of the crowns, keeping temperatures in check during sustained high-speed runs. The crankshaft was forged steel, supported by 7 main bearings that looked like they belonged in a diesel truck. This was an engine designed to cross continents at triple-digit speeds without breaking a sweat. It was not a fragile piece of jewelry that needed constant adjustment. It was a hammer, but power is useless without the control systems to manage it, and the Aristo needed a chassis that could handle this iron heart without losing its composure. To harness the violence of the twin-turbo engine, Toyota needed a suspension system that was equally over-engineered. Most cars of this era used simple McPherson struts because they were cheap and space-efficient. The Aristo rejected that compromise entirely. Instead, the engineers utilized a fully independent double wishbone architecture at all 4 corners. This setupus complex. It takes up valuable space that could have been used for the trunk or the engine bay. But the advantage is absolute control over the geometry of the wheel. When the suspension compresses mid-corner, a double wishbone system keeps the tire perfectly flat against the pavement. It maximizes the contact patch of the rubber. This meant that despite the significant weight of the steel chassis, the Aristo could carry speed through a corner with a level of composure that shocked European rivals. It was a suspension designed for the Autobahn, not just the parking lot. The placement of that iron block engine was another calculated decision. The 2JZ is a long, heavy piece of metal. If you hang it too far over the front axle, the car becomes nose-heavy and refuses to turn. To solve this, Toyota pushed the engine as far back against the firewall as possible. They effectively created a front midship layout. By centering the mass within the wheelbase, they reduced the polar moment of inertia. This is engineering speak for saying the car wanted to change direction. It did not fight the driver. It balanced the heft of the cast iron block with the physics of a sports car. For the top tire V300 Vertex edition, Toyota introduced a piece of technology that felt like science fiction in the late 1990s. It was called active rear steering, or ARS. This system used an electronic actuator to turn the rear wheels. At low speeds, the rear wheels turned opposite to the front, shrinking the turning radius and making this large sedan park like a compact car. At high speeds, they turned in the same direction, sliding the car diagonally into a lane change with zero instability. It was complex, heavy, and expensive, but it proved that Toyota was obsessed with making this large executive express feel agile. It was a glimpse of the future that few people noticed at the time. Of course, sending nearly 300 horsepower to the rear wheels, sofa luxury car required a safety net. The Aristo was one of the early adopters of vehicle stability control, or VSC. In 1997, this was cutting edge. Sensors monitored wheel speed, steering angle, and yaw rate hundreds, off times a second. If the car began to slide, the computer would selectively brake individual wheels to bring it back in line. It was a primitive system by modern standards, but it allowed a businessman to drive a 300 horsepower rear-wheel drive car in the rain without fear. There was a distinct difference in how this chassis was tuned compared to its sexport sibling, the Lexus GS. The American market demanded a softer, floating ride that isolated the driver from the road. The Japanese Aristo V300 was tuned for precision. It used stiffer springs, firmer dampers, and thicker anti-roll bars. It was designed to handle the high-speed expressway network of Japan, where stability at 180 kilometers per hour is mandatory. This created a driving experience that was heavy but communicative. It did not dance like a lightweight sports car. It crushed the road into submission. It felt dense, substantial, and unbreakable. It was the difference between a hollow tin can and a solid steel ingot. The trade-off was weight, but in the 90s, weight meant quality. The engineering under the metal was focused on control and durability. But for the owner, the experience was defined by what they could touch and feel inside the cabin. Stepping inside the Aristo V300 is not like entering a modern luxury car. There is no ambient lighting strip that changes a million colors. There are no massive touchscreens dominating the dashboard to demand your attention. Instead, there is a sense of density. The first thing you notice is the sound of the door closing. It does not click, it thuds. It is a heavy, muted impact that seals the cabin from the outside world like an airlock. This specific sound was engineered. It was the result of heavy steel skins, thick rubber seals, and substantial hinges that were designed to carry the weight of the car's ambition. It communicated safety before the engine even started, a physical promise that the occupants were protected from the chaos outside. Once seated, the driver is greeted by a void. The instrument cluster is completely black until the key is turned. Then, 3 deep, electroluminescent dials ignite from the darkness. This is the Optitron system. In the early 90s, this was a revelation. It used cold cathode tubesto to create a high contrast display that was perfectly legible in direct sunlight. Unlike modern digital clusters that simulate analog dials on a flat screen, the Optitron gauge shed physical depth. The needles floated above the numbers, glowing with a crisp white light that felt expensive. It was a piece of theater that never grew old. A daily reminder that this machine was special, blending the mechanical precision of the engine with the electric clarity of the display. The materials surrounding the driver tell a story of a different era of manufacturing. Critics at the time sometimes complained that the interior lacked the flair of a Jaguar or the architectural severity of an Audi, but they missed the point. The Aristo's cabin was built for geological time. The dashboard was not made of hard, scratchy plastic, but a soft, slush-molded urethane that resisted cracking under the intense Japanese sun. The wood trim, whether real or simulated depending on the specific grade, was applied with a restraint that bordered on conservatism. It was not there to dazzle, it was there to calm. The leather on the seats was gathered rather than pulled tight, allowing for a plush, sofa-like comfort that encouraged relaxation rather than alert driving. This brings us to the concept of tactile luxury, something the automotive industry has largely abandoned. In a modern car, luxury is defined by features and connectivity. In the Aristo, luxury was defined by resistance. Every button, every knob, and every switch was damped. When you turned the volume dial on the stereo, it moved through a thick, honey-like fluid. It didn't spin freely. It required deliberate intention. The window switches had a distinct soft click that felt substantial under the fingertip. Even the ashtray, a standard feature of the 90s executive sedan, glided open with a slow, hydraulic grace. These were small details, but they accumulated to create an atmosphere of immense quality. Toyota's engineers spent money on things you could feel rather than things you could see. The isolation was equally deliberate. The Aristo was designed to be a library at 150 kilometers per hour. To achieve this, the engineers didn't just add sound deadening, they attacked the source of the noise. They used liquid-filled engine mounts to absorb the vibrations of the two JZS inline 6. They placed asphalt sheets between the steel floor and the carpet to deaden road roar. The result was a cabin that divorced the occupants from the violence happening under the hood. You could be accelerating hard enough to pin your passengers against the leather, yet the conversation in the front seat would not need to rise above a whisper. This was the Vertex experience, a peak of analog refinement. There is a melancholy in looking at this interior today. We have traded this tactile permanence for digital obsolescence. The Aristo's simple LCD climate display will likely work for another 50 years. The buttons will still click with that same satisfying weight. It represents a philosophy of functional luxury, where the interface was designed to serve the driver, not distract them. It was the final evolution of the analog cockpit before the screens took over, a quiet, comfortable fortress built to outlast its owners. The hierarchy of the Aristo lineup was deceptively simple, yet it created a rigid caste system on the Japanese streets. At the bottom sat the S300. This was the rational choice, the vehicle purchased by the company executive who needed reliability and comfort, but had absolutely no interest in testing the speed limiter. It was powered by the naturally aspirated 2 JZS, a smooth and capable engine, but one that lacked the forced induction magic of its big brother. The S300 was the volume seller, the car you saw idling in taxi queues or parked outside government ministries. It was dignified, certainly, but it was not the legend. The legend was exclusively the domain of the V300. This badge on the trunk lid changed the entire context of the machine. It signified the presence of the twin-turbo power plant and the heavy-duty chassis upgrades. But Toyota did not stop at just the engine. They introduced a specific trim level that became... You could be accelerating hard enough to pin your passengers against the leather, yet the conversation in the front seat would not need to rise above a whisper. This was the Vertex experience, a peak of analog refinement. There is a melancholy in looking at this interior today. We have traded this tactile permanence for digital obsolescence. The Aristo's simple LCD climate display will likely work for another 50 years. The buttons will still click with that same satisfying weight. It represents a philosophy of functional luxury, where the interface was designed to serve the driver, not distract them. It was the final evolution of the analog cockpit before the screens took over, a quiet, comfortable fortress built to outlast its owners. The hierarchy of the Aristo lineup was deceptively simple, yet it created a rigid caste system on the Japanese streets. At the bottom sat the S300. This was the rational choice, the vehicle purchased by the company executive who needed reliability and comfort, but had absolutely no interest in testing the speed limiter. It was powered by the naturally aspirated 2 JZS, a smooth and capable engine, but one that lacked the forced induction magic of its big brother. The S300 was the volume seller, the car you saw idling in taxi queues or parked outside government ministries. It was dignified, certainly, but it was not the legend. The legend was exclusively the domain of the V300. This badge on the trunk lid changed the entire context of the machine. It signified the presence of the twin-turbo power plant and the heavy-duty chassis upgrades. But Toyota did not stop at just the engine. They introduced a specific trim level that became the definitive identity for the chassis, the Vertex edition. If the standard Aristo was a black tuxedo, the Vertex edition was a tuxedo worn by a hitman. It took the restrained elegance of the base car and added a layer of menace that was impossible to ignore if you knew the code. The visual changes were subtle, a masterclass in factory restraint that modern designers have largely forgotten. The chrome brightwork around the grille and windows was often darkened to a black chrome finish, stripping away the old-world brightness for something more industrial. A subtle trunk spoiler was added, not to generate massive downforce for a track day, but to clean up the airflow at highway speeds. The wheels were upgraded to polished 17-inch alloys, which were considered large for the time, filling the wheel wells with a stance the standard 16-inch rollers lacked. Inside, the Vertex edition often featured a unique black interior with textured geometric fabric inserts in the seats. In Japan, high-quality cloth is often preferred over leather for its breathability and grip, and in the Aristo, it signaled that this was a cabin designed for driving, not just riding. This specific combination created the ultimate sleeper aesthetic. To the uninitiated, a V300 Vertex edition looked almost identical to a base model S300 or a harmless family sedan. It did not have the flared fenders of a Nissan Skyline GTR or the massive wing of a Subaru STI blended in. You could drive it to a client meeting without raising a single eyebrow, yet it possessed the mechanical capability to embarrass a Porsche 911 at a stoplight. This duality was the core of its appeal. It allowed the owner to opt out of the shouting match of automotive styling while still carrying the biggest stick on the road. For those who found even the Vertex edition too tame, Toyota offered something truly special through their factory-affiliated tuner, Tom's. The VA300 was a rare beast, a complete package that recalibrated the engine management, upgraded the exhaust, and stiffened the suspension beyond the factory specifications. These cars are the unicorns of the Aristo world, blurring the line between a production vehicle and a tuner project. They represented the peak of the chassis' potential, fully sanctioned by the manufacturer. It was an acknowledgement by Toyota that the Aristo was not just a luxury car, but a platform for performance that could be pushed further than the lawyers typically allowed. Marketing this car was a delicate balancing act. Toyota positioned the Aristo squarely against the giants of Europe, the BMW 5 Series and the Mercedes-Benz E-Class. But while the Germans were adding displacement with V8 engines to signal prestige, Toyota stuck to their inline-six philosophy. They bet that the smoothness and technical superiority of the twin-turbo setup would outweigh the cylinder count. In Japan, they were right. The Aristo V300 became a cult icon, a symbol of domestic engineering prowess that didn't need to copy the West to compete. However, this specific identity, the turbocharged high-tech Executive Express, was about to face a strange bifurcation. As the Aristo looked toward the Pacific Ocean, its identity would be split in two. Cultural divide. In North America, the Lexus GS became the preferred transport for suburban professionals. It was a car for real estate agents and dentists who wanted reliability and a quiet cabin. It was respected, but it was rarely feared. Meanwhile, in Tokyo and Osaka, the Aristo V300 was building a fearsome reputation on the expressways. It was the weapon for racers and enthusiasts who wanted a platform handling 600 horsepower. The Aristo was a tuner car disguised as a limousine. The GS was simply a limousine. For years, this duality remained a secret. Western enthusiasts looked at the mundane GS300, unaware its chassis was designed for one of history's greatest engines. The Aristo badge became a piece of forbidden fruit, a symbol of the good stuff that Toyota kept for itself. It wasn't until the internet era fully matured that the global community realized the Lexus GS was essentially a neutered Aristo. This realization sparked a wave of envy, and eventually, a movement to reunite the chassis with its rightful engine. Enthusiasts began correcting the factory's mistake. Importing Aristo, build the cars Toyota refused to sell. The story of the Aristo name officially ended in 2005. Toyota decided to launch the Lexus brand domestically in Japan, unifying their global lineup. The third-generation GS replaced the Aristo, and with it, the option for a turbocharged inline-six vanished. The new cars were superior, faster around a track, and filled with more technology. But they lost the raw mechanical charisma of the JZS161. The retirement of the Aristo badge marked the end of the era where a Japanese sedan could be a split personality, a polite executive by day and a street fighter by night. The secret was out, but the factory had already closed the door. Yet while its contemporaries from Nissan and Mazda faded into rust and obscurity, the Aristo managed to achieve a strange kind of immortality. How did this one sedan survive the graveyard of Japanese ambition? Look at the landscape of Japanese luxury sedans from the 1990s today. It is a graveyard of ambition. The Nissan President, the Honda Legend, and the Mazda Sentia were all technological marvels of their time, packed with complex V8 engines and proprietary active suspension systems. But when those unique components failed, the cars became disposable. They faded from the streets because keeping them alive required a level of dedication that exceeded their market value. The Aristo V300, however, refused to die. Its survival was not an accident. It was a direct result of Toyota's decision to build it from a shared arsenal of parts. The Aristo was never an orphan. Its heart was the 2JZGTE, an engine supported by a massive global aftermarket thanks to the Supra. Its skeleton was shared with the Toyota Crown and the Majesta. This meant that when a water pump failed or a control arm bent, the replacement part was not a special order item from a defunct warehouse. It was sitting on a shelf at a local parts store. This mechanical ubiquity meant the Aristo could be kept on the road cheaply, long after its rivals had been crushed into cubes. It allowed the car to transition from the hands-off, the first owner, the executive, to the second owner, the enthusiast. This second life was defined by tire smoke. As the price of the Supra skyrocketed into the stratosphere, the Aristo became the working man's alternative. It was the four-door Supra, offering the same potential for massive horsepower, but with a usable back seat. The drift culture embraced the chassis because the long wheelbase made it predictable at the limit. That rigid robot-welded body shell provided a stiffness that allowed drifters to initiate high-speed slides with confidence. It became a common sight at circuits like Ebisu, sliding door-to-door with purpose-built sports cars, its twin turbos screaming a very different song than the V8 Sofit's German competitors. However, immortality has a maintenance schedule. The Aristo is a heavy machine, and physics eventually takes a toll. The complex double wishbone suspension that provides such incredible stability relies on a network of rubber bushings. After 2 decades of holding up nearly 1,700 kilograms, these bushings disintegrate. The clunking over bumps becomes the soundtrack of a neglected example, a reminder that this level of engineering requires investment to maintain. The door lock actuators are another known weak point, often failing one by one until the owner is forced to use the physical key like a peasant. The electronics, while robust for the era, are beginning to show their age, with capacitors in the ECU occasionally leaking and causing erratic behavior. Despite these aging pains, the reputation of the car has shifted from a depreciated luxury barge to a legitimate classic. The drift tax has arrived. The days of finding a clean V300 for pennies are gone, replaced by a market that finally understands what this machine represents. Values are climbing as collectors realize that this specific combination of reliability, tuning potential, and executive comfort will never happen again. It is no longer just a used car. It is a survivor of a golden era. It outlasted the bubble that birthed it, and the competitors that tried to kill it. But even as the enthusiasts kept the flame alive, the factory was preparing to extinguish it. The era of the over-engineered inline-six was drawing to a close, and the Aristo was about to face its final sunset. The final chapter of the Aristo story began with a subtle evolution rather than a revolution. In 2001, Toyota introduced a mid-cycle refresh that polished the rough edges of the design without altering its fundamental character. The visual updates were restrained, as was the custom for Japanese luxury cars of the period. The headlights received a distinctive green tint and a new internal structure, while the rear taillights were updated to a clearer, more modern design. Inside, the cabin received higher quality wood grains and revised fabric patterns for the Vertex edition, pushing the atmosphere further up market. Mechanically, the engineers tweaked the suspension valving. They softened the initial compression damping to better absorb the sharp impact of bridge expansion joints and potholes. This made the ride more compliant for daily use, yet they managed to retain the flat cornering attitude that defined the chassis. It was a masterful display of suspension tuning, proving that a heavy steel car could still dance if the dampers were high quality. But these refinements were merely the final polish on a dying breed. In January 2005, the production lines at the Tahara plant finally fell silent for the JZS161. This date is significant. It marked the absolute end of the two JZG-TE lineage. The Supra had departed the world stage 3 years prior, leaving the Aristo V300 as the sole custodian of Toyota's greatest engine. When the last Aristo rolled off the line, it took with it the philosophy of the iron block inline 6. The car that replaced it, the third-generation Lexus GS, was a technological marvel, but it represented a different set of priorities. The inline 6 was abandoned in favor of the GR series V6 engines. On paper, the V6 was shorter, lighter, and more fuel-efficient. It allowed for better crash safety packaging and improved weight distribution. But for the driver, something intangible was lost. A V6 engine released on counterweights and balanced shafts to mask its inherent vibrations. It can never achieve the perfect natural balance of an inline 6. The sensation of infinite turbine-like smoothness was replaced by a power delivery that felt coarser and more industrial. The steering also changed. The Aristo used a heavy hydraulic power steering system that provided genuine feedback from the road surface. The new models moved toward electric power steering, which saved fuel but severed the connection between the driver's hands and the front tires. The heavy, oily resistance of the Aristo's wheel was replaced by a numb, artificial lightness. Furthermore, the transition marked the victory of electronics over mechanics. The new generation was defined by its hybrid systems, its radar sensors, and its complex stability management that intervened before the driver even knew there was a problem. The Aristo came from the twilight of analog engineering. Its excellence was physical. It relied on the thickness of its control arms, the density of its casting, and the precision of its welding. It was a machine you could understand by looking at it. It was repairable. It was built to be owned for decades, not leased for 3 years and discarded. The JZS161 stands as the final monument to a time when Toyota allowed its engineers to build a car that was arguably too good for its own good. The Toyota Aristo V300 remains a singular achievement. It was a car that successfully lived 2 lives at once. It was a respectable executive transport that could blend into any corporate setting, and it was a street weapon capable of humiliating supercars. It was the ultimate sleeper. Today, these cars are not just used sedans. They are artifacts of a philosophy that prioritize durability above all else. They prove that true luxury is not about the number of screens in the dashboard, but the quality of the engineering underneath. If you appreciate these stories of lost automotive greatness, subscribe to the channel.